President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin held a highly anticipated video meeting Tuesday. Their talks come as concerns grow about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine early next year. As CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes reports, President Biden has warned the U.S. would take action should Russia invade.
Hello.
Добрый день.
Good to see you again.
Приветствую вас, господин президент.
It was a rare 2-hour face-to-face with an urgent agenda to talk Russia out of invading a U.S. ally. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was with President Biden for the call.
He told President Putin directly that if Russia further invades Ukraine, the United States and our European allies would respond with strong economic measures.
This is what has the White House concerned. Close to 100,000 Russian troops now amassed at the Ukrainian border. Ukraine, a large former Soviet republic, wants to join the U.S. and most of Europe in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In a statement after today's meeting, the Kremlin argued it is NATO that is making dangerous attempts to expand into the Ukrainian territory. Putin is calling for legally fixed guarantees excluding the expansion of NATO in the eastern direction. President Biden said no.
President Biden made that point crystal clear to President Putin today that the issue of who joins NATO is an issue for NATO to decide.
Testifying on Capitol Hill, Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland warned the Ukrainians themselves may rise up if Russia attacks.
I think the Russians will have a very big fight on their hands, that there will be severe casualties for them.
What was Putin's demeanor over the course of the 2 hours? Did he signal any willingness to back down?
I would say that his demeanor, like President Biden's demeanor, was direct and straightforward. And President Putin was deeply engaged. And I'm going to leave it at that in terms of trying to characterize where he is.
And Nancy joins me now with more from the White House. Hi there, Nancy. So first off, how significant was this virtual meeting for President Biden's foreign policy agenda and his overall presidency?
Well, I'd say, first of all, that it's very rare for the President of the United States to have a 2-hour video call with anyone, let alone a leader with whom he's clashed before, President Putin. And it is clear that the White House had a series of messages, you could even call them threats, that he wanted to issue to the Russian president, the things that they say will happen if Putin invades neighboring Ukraine. First and foremost, economic measures. And they wanted to make it clear to Putin that this is not the U.S. acting alone, that he is working with major European leaders, the leaders of Germany and France and England and Italy, who he spoke with before and after this call, by the way, that they would impose measures that go far beyond what they were willing to do in the past, specifically when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. President Biden, according to his aides, said today that not only would these measures devalue the Russian ruble, but they could also cut off Western investment and make it very difficult for Russian banks to do business with the West. They're hoping that those consequences will be enough to deter Putin. But if that isn't enough, President Biden also warned that the U.S. might send more troops to Eastern European allies to help them defend themselves against Russian aggression, and it even threatened that perhaps the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project, which would run from Russia to Germany, could be affected, could even be scrapped. Although, of course, the U.S. would not make the final decision there. That would be Germany.
Yeah, well, given the stakes that you just laid out, Nancy, how exactly is the White House describing Tuesday's meeting between Presidents Biden and Putin?
They are saying that it was a useful meeting, that this was a frank conversation, an exchange of views, that they weren't just reading prepared scripts, but that they were actually having a dialogue. And they say that aides to these two leaders have agreed to speak soon and continue the dialogue. But really now, the White House is going to do some watching and some waiting to see what Putin does with the information that he has received. Is he going to pull troops back from the Ukraine border? Is he going to continue sending more troops to the Ukrainian border? Is he going to continue to blast both Ukraine and Russia with disinformation? That's one of the really interesting facets of all this, is that cybersecurity experts say that they've seen a huge spike in disinformation campaigns aimed at justifying a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, what happens there? Those are the kinds of signs that the U.S. is going to be watching for as it waits to see whether some of these warnings and threats sunk in.
So what are U.S. intelligence officials saying about, the reality of possible military action here, given what it is that they're seeing?
Well, they say that at this point there are about 100,000 Russian troops at the border, and that it's very possible that Russia could try to bring in about 75,000 more troops and strike in the month of January, when the ground is frozen, when it would be easiest for Russia to go across the border. That's what they're concerned about. They say that they're still not sure whether Putin has made up his mind about whether or not to strike, but clearly he is looking to send a message of strength to Ukraine and to the West. And part of the reason he's doing that is not only because Putin has long made no secret of the fact that he'd like to annex big chunks of Ukraine and believes that they are rightfully parts of Russia, but also because Ukraine has been trying very hard to become a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that includes most European nations and also the U.S. And that's something that would be alarming to Russia, to see its largest neighbor to the West becoming a member of this huge Western alliance. And so Putin tried to get some assurances from President Biden that Ukraine would not be allowed to join NATO. But President Biden rejected that request and is saying that that's up to NATO and the NATO countries, and that President Biden can't impose that kind of restriction, and nor can Putin.
I think the question is about leverage here. And as you mentioned, President Biden has warned Russia there would be a strong economic response and other possible measures in the event of a military escalation. But what options are on the table exactly at this point?
We've tried to get specifics from the White House, particularly when it comes to these economic measures, and they've been reluctant to spell it out so far. They say that they are working very closely behind the scenes with other major European allies. They say Treasury officials are dedicated to this, working through with their EU partners exactly what kinds of sanctions they've imposed. Russia is very used to significant sanctions being imposed by the West, and clearly that hasn't deterred Russia in the past. So what the president is trying to do now is to send a signal that the U.S. would go even further than it has before, and that it isn't just the U.S. working alone this time, that other major European countries, which in the past have been more reluctant to punish Russia because economically that country is much more important to them than it is to the U.S. He's looking to send a signal now that all of these nations are on the same page, and that those European nations might be willing to join the U.S. in, say, cutting off Russian banks from dealing with the West. That's something that would have a very crippling effect on the Russian economy.
All right, incredibly high stakes. Nancy Cordes at the White House for us. Nancy, thanks so much.
You're welcome.